For my first comparison, I have this TED Talk by Dr. Lieberman. He talks about this one experience with AIDS, how in the 1970s it was also stigmatized and there was no cure. However, after several hundred victims, research was funded by the government, and later on, AZT was created to help against AIDS. This raises the question on why it can't be done for the same for mental illness. Dr. Lieberman is basically saying unless the stigma for mental illness disappears, it'll be further away until we get a cure. And that relates to the text during the beginning of the 20th century concerning nature versus nurture debates, because some researchers at the time even said people with mental illness aren't people at all. Lieberman talks about how we should advocate more for mental illness as we do with other diseases like smoking causing lung cancer, heart disease, and more. I thought this was important to mention because this is basically the opposite of what happens in the text. For instance, all the family members of the Galvins literally shamed their oldest son by giving him the nickname Geekoid, and it's basically an insult compared to him because he was always having delusions from schizophrenia. And in the end, there's this quote from Lindsay, a sense that their sacrifice may make it better for the future generations. I felt this was a powerful quote to wrap up my point because Lieberman talks about how sacrifices created the awareness society needed to end the stigma around AIDS, and in the text it's portrayed how Lindsay's family is the subject of that. This shows immense character development because Lindsay initially wanted to run away from her sick family to now becoming their caretaker. And then for my second comparison, I have this comic called Invincible Ignorance, where a scientist has basically proven something with facts and research, but the other person just outright denies it because they don't want to believe it. And this relates to the text because I feel like the man who's denying everything represents Mimi, who is the mom of the 12 children. While Donald was getting checked up for his odd behavior prior to being diagnosed as having schizophrenia, the parents had their doctor write a letter to their university saying that everything was alright, even though it wasn't, because Donald had murdered a cat, which would foreshadow his later actions. The reason this connection is so important is that it reveals the stigma around schizophrenia and other mental illnesses in general at the beginning of the 20th century. Another quote to back this up is, as long as Donald was well enough to try living somewhere else, these trips to Aspen would continue. At the time, Don, the father, had an elite company and would often go to trips with all these prestigious people. So this just shows how even the family didn't think much of the illness and would dismiss it in pursuit of other priorities. And it begs to ask the question whether nurture might have a bigger role than we initially thought, and if ridding stigma was the true catalyst to finding a cure. For my third comparison, I have this song by Ed Sheeran called The A-Team. It goes through the life of a cocaine addict, and it's evident in the lyrics such as breathing in snowflakes and going mad for a couple grams, which describe the addiction to substance abuse. It relates throughout the text because nearly all the Galvin children abused drugs, even while they were still kids. One instance of this was Brian, who frequently held parties at the house for smoking pot, and eventually he moved on to LSD. The reason this resonates with limited knowledge of human psyche is that drug addictions can actually cause mental damage, lead to confusion, and decision making. The thing is, the parents never even batted an eye. They said that the fact that Brian might have been suffering unnoticed just as young Donald had, never crossed their minds. To them, Brian was so talented they didn't need to care for him. But this is all the more reason this is so important, because he eventually killed his ex-girlfriend and himself too, and it was discovered that he had schizophrenic behavior. This made me question the whole time why the parents never did anything about his drug addiction, and as a bigger picture, paints the fact that even really talented people can still be affected by mental illness, which just shows how serious it is. And then for my fourth comparison, I have this book called The Handmaid's Tale, and basically the most prominent role women played in the book was being inferior to men. They couldn't have jobs, they couldn't vote, they just couldn't do anything that would make them remotely equal to men. One instance of this in the text was when Lyndon Leasy was working with his male coworkers and they wanted her to take faults for the other men's mistakes because they were up for promotion, which just shows how arrogant some men were back then. And then there's this quote from The Handmaid's Tale right here where Aunt Lydia would place the blame on women victims being raped rather than the men that instigated it. And that reminds me in the text when Lindsay confessed that Jim had molested her and raped her while she was younger, but Mimi, the mom, just dismissed the fact, saying that he was sick, so it's okay. I think this is really important overall because it just shows how even people surrounded by mental illness are affected. Through art as a symbol, Margaret also suffered from Jim's rape, and her paintings depict that. When she painted all the Galvin children, Jim was colored spectral black and white, which are dark and empty. All the other family members had colors such as pink, which perhaps harbored positive emotions, and it makes you wonder how much more happy the two daughters would have been had they not been ostracized by their mother, who dismissed their trauma based off of, mental illness. And for my final comparison, I have this painting by Gertler. I chose this painting because it represents a symbol to display the nature versus nurture arguments in Hidden Valley Road. As opposed to normal merry-go-rounds, this one has a more satirical and dark theme, which I thought best describes nature versus nurture, because everyone's disagreeing with one another. Rue L. Cromwell describes the researchers finding the cure to schizophrenia. Everyone is so focused on their own remedy to the illness that they exclude the possibilities of others. So no one is working together. Like a merry-go-round, the ride is thrilling, but at the end of the day, the people are just going in circles, so no progress is actually made. A quote to back this up is, "Unwillingness to collaborate leaves everyone vulnerable to confirmation bias." So this proves everyone only wants their beliefs to be true. This is significant because we can imagine how much more work researchers would have accomplished had they all worked together. Because in the end, schizophrenia was just a culmination of many different discoveries. From the success of prevention and doctors being encouraged to spend more time with their patients, both nature and nurture are having an effect to cure schizophrenia. There's also the illness spectrum, so we see that some patients need medicine, while others are just better off with some therapy, because medicine can sometimes induce negative side effects, such as permanent brain damage. So we see how nature and nurture are intertwined to accommodate the sick ones. And these are my works cited.